My name's Mike, and I'm 41. My wife, Emily, is 39, and we've been married for 12 years. We have 2 kids, Liam, 10, and Sophie, 7. And on the surface, we've built a nice, stable life together. I run a small accounting firm, and Emily works part-time as a teacher's aide. Life was good, or at least I thought it was. Looking back now, I guess the signs were always there. Emily's always been fiery, quick to argue and just as quick to charm her way out of trouble. That spark is part of what drew me to her, but over the years it's also been what's made things complicated. The first hint that something was wrong came a few months ago. Emily had reconnected with an old college friend, Jake, through social media. She mentioned it casually one night during dinner, scrolling through her phone. "Remember Jake?" she said, showing me a picture of a guy I vaguely recognized. "We were close back in college. He's just moved back to town." I nodded, not thinking much of it. I'd heard the name before. She'd mentioned him in passing over the years, mostly in the context of how they'd lost touch after graduation. "That's nice," I said, genuinely happy for her. Emily didn't have a lot of friends outside of work, and I figured it'd be good for her to reconnect with someone from her past. But then, things started to change. First, it was small stuff. She'd text more often, her phone always lighting up with notifications. When I asked who it was, she'd wave me off with, "Oh, it's just Jake. He's hilarious. You'd like him." Then came the coffee meetups. "I'm meeting Jake for coffee after work," she'd say, grabbing her bag. "He's going through a tough time and needs someone to talk to." "Okay," I'd reply, though I couldn't shake the feeling that she was a little too eager to leave. She started dressing up more for these coffee dates. Nothing over the top, but definitely putting in more effort than usual. Curling her hair, wearing lipstick, spritzing on perfume. When I teased her about it, she rolled her eyes. "Don't be ridiculous, Mike. It's just coffee. Jake's a friend. You know I'd never do anything to hurt you." Her words should have reassured me, but instead, they left a bitter taste in my mouth. At first, I told myself I was overthinking things. Emily wasn't the cheating type, or at least that's what I wanted to believe. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away, especially as her behavior became harder to ignore. The turning point came one Saturday morning. Emily said she was going to a workshop at school, but something didn't sit right with me. She had that same extra effort in her appearance. The curled hair, the faint scent of vanilla perfume she only used on special occasions. I decided to check her phone after she left. I know, it's not my proudest moment, but I needed answers. Her messages with Jake were locked behind a password-protected app one didn't recognize. That alone made my heart pound. Emily wasn't tech-savvy enough to randomly download something like this. When I couldn't get in, I searched for clues in her photos instead. Most of them were of the kids or random selfies, but buried in a folder titled Work Stuff was a picture that made my stomach drop. It was a selfie of her and Jake at a restaurant, her hand on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. She looked happy. Too happy. Later that day, I decided to dig deeper. I remembered that Emily's laptop had her email automatically logged in. She never logged out, and I figured it might give me the answers I was looking for. Sure enough, I found an email from Jake. Subject: "Can't wait to see you tonight." Body: "Last night was amazing. I've missed this connection. You're incredible." I sat there, my chest tightening as the words blurred in front of me. Last night? She told me she'd been at a PTA meeting. When Emily got home that afternoon, I tried to act normal, but I was boiling inside. She walked in with a smile, holding a reusable coffee cup. "Hey, babe. Workshop went great. How's your day been?" "Fine," I said flatly, barely looking up from the TV. Her smile faltered for a moment, but then she shrugged it off and walked to the kitchen. "Everything okay?" she called out. "Yeah," I said, but it wasn't. That night, I decided to test her. "Jake seems like a nice guy," I said casually over dinner. She froze for just a second before forcing a laugh. "Yeah, he's great." "Why?" "Just wondering. You've been spending a lot of time with him lately." Her tone sharpened instantly. "Are you seriously going to start with this jealousy crap, Mike? I've told you 100 times. It's nothing. He's going through a rough patch, and I'm just being a friend. Her defensiveness only made me more certain that something was wrong. But it was her next words that hit me like a brick. Besides, it's not like you've been perfect. What the hell does that mean? I shot back, stunned. She shrugged, grabbing her plate and heading to the sink. Nothing. Forget I said anything. Couldn't. Emily's words haunted me all night. It's not like you've been perfect. What the hell was she implying? I racked my brain, trying to figure out what she meant, but I came up empty. The next day, I decided to confront Jake directly. I knew where he worked. Emily had mentioned it in passing, and after dropping the kids off at their grandparents', I drove to his office. Jake was sitting at a cafe across the street, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. It felt like fate had handed me the perfect opportunity. "Jake," I said, standing in front of his table. He looked up, startled, but quickly recovered, flashing a smile. "Mike, right? Emily's husband." "That's me," I said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "What brings you here?" he asked casually, but I could see the tension in his eyes. "Cut the crap, Jake," I said. "I know what's going on." His smile faltered. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't play dumb," I snapped. "I've seen the emails, the late-night meetups. What the hell are you doing with my wife?" Jake leaned back, crossing his arms. "Look, Mike, I get it. You're upset. But it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I demanded. He hesitated, then said, "Emily and we've always had a connection, but it's not about you. It's about us." I clenched my fists under the table, my heart pounding. "You're seriously trying to justify this?" Jake leaned in, his voice dropping. "If you'd been paying attention to her, maybe she wouldn't have come to me." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Stay the hell away from my wife," I said through gritted teeth. He smirked, his confidence infuriating. "That's up to her, don't you think?" I stormed out, my blood boiling. That night, I confronted Emily again. "Why don't you tell me about Jake?" I said as soon as the kids were in bed. She sighed, clearly annoyed. "Oh my God, Mike. Not this again." "I talked to him," I said flatly. Her eyes widened for a split second before she forced a laugh. "You're unbelievable." "What, you're stalking him now? Don't turn this around on me," I snapped. "I know what you've been doing. The emails, the meetups. Don't even try to deny it." She crossed her arms, her face hardening. "Fine, you want the truth?" "Yes, I've been meeting Jake. But it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I demanded. She hesitated, her jaw tightening. "He's going through a divorce, Mike. He needed someone to talk to. I was just being there for him." "That's funny," I said bitterly, "because he seems to think it's a lot more than that." Her face turned red, and she glared at me. "Oh, so now you're taking his word over mine? I don't know who to believe anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "But if you don't start telling me the truth, I'll find out on my own." She stared at me, her eyes flashing with anger. "You know what your problem is, Mike? You're so paranoid you can't even see when someone's trying to be a good person. Maybe if you weren't so controlling, I wouldn't feel like I needed space." Her words felt like a slap, but I refused to back down. "I'm not the one sneaking around," I said coldly. She didn't respond, storming upstairs and slamming the bedroom door. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen. Emily was lying to me. I was sure of it. But there was something deeper going on, and I was determined to find out what it was. The tension between Emily and me was unbearable over the next few days. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was curt and full of unspoken accusations. I wasn't ready to let this go, not by a long shot. While she was out running errands, I went back to her laptop. This time, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A folder buried deep in her documents, titled Old Times. It was full of photos from her college days, including several of her with Jake. They looked close in every picture, always standing a little too close, always smiling a little too wide. But one file stood out, a scanned letter from Jake to Emily. Asterisco asterisco ing. I don't know how else to say this, but I need to distance myself from you. Your boyfriend, Mike, right? He's ruining everything for me. You told me he didn't mean to, but that doesn't change the fact that I lost the internship I worked so hard for because of him. I can't look at him and I can't pretend this doesn't hurt. You're amazing, but I need to focus on rebuilding my future. I hope you understand. Jake asterisk asterisk. I sat back in my chair, stunned. I'd had no idea that Jake even knew who I was back in college, let alone that I'd inadvertently cost him an internship. Was this why he'd come back into Emily's life? Was this why he was so smug when I confronted him? My heart pounded as I realized this wasn't just an affair. This was revenge. I decided to confront Emily with what I'd found. That evening, while we sat in the living room, I pulled out a printout of the letter and handed it to her. Her eyes scanned the page, and her face went pale. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. "Does it matter?" I asked. "What I want to know is why you didn't tell me about this." She looked up at me, her expression a mix of guilt and anger. "Because it's ancient history, Mike. It doesn't matter anymore." "Doesn't matter?" I said, my voice rising. "Jake clearly thinks it matters. He's been using you to get back at me, and you've been letting him." "That's not true," she snapped. "Jake isn't like that. He's a good person. He wouldn't do something like that." I laughed bitterly. "You really believe that? Then why did he write this? And why has he been coming between us?" She hesitated, her jaw tightening. "You don't understand, Mike. He was hurt. He felt like his life fell apart because of what happened. I was just trying to make things right. By sneaking around behind my back?" I shot back. "By lying to me?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "You've never taken responsibility for anything, have you? You didn't even know what you did to him." "I didn't know because you never told me," I shouted. We stared at each other, the air between us crackling with tension. Finally, she broke the silence. "Fine," she said coldly. "Yes, Jake was angry at you, but this isn't about revenge. This is about you being so obsessed with control that you can't stand me having a life outside of you." Her words stung, but I wasn't buying her excuses anymore. "If this isn't about revenge," I said, "then tell me what it's really about." She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her keys and stormed out of the house. I was left sitting in the silence, my mind spinning. Emily was hiding something, and I wasn't going to stop until I figured out what it was. Emily didn't come back that night. I texted her a few times, but she didn't respond. I wasn't sure if she was with Jake or just blowing off steam, but either way, the silence was deafening. The next morning, I decided to keep digging. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. I reached out to an old college friend of mine, Nick, who had a knack for remembering the kinds of details most people forgot. "Do you remember Jake?" I asked when Nick picked up the phone. "Jake? You mean Emily's old boyfriend?" he replied. "Yeah, I remember him. Why?" I hesitated. "He's back in town, and I think there's more to his story than I realized back in college." Nick chuckled bitterly. "Yeah, I bet there is. You know, he blamed you for losing that big internship, right?" I gripped the phone tighter. "I've heard something about that. What exactly happened?" "Jake was supposed to intern at that marketing firm. What was it called? Clearwater or something. Anyway, he didn't get it because they found out he had ties to another company that was caught in some shady deals. The thing is, you were working part-time at that company back then, weren't you?" I froze. He was right. I'd done some clerical work for a company that ended up embroiled in a scandal, but I'd barely been involved. "They must have assumed you two were connected," Nick continued. "Jake was furious. He thought you sabotaged him on purpose." "I had no idea," I said quietly. "Yeah, well, he made a big deal about it back then," Nick said. "Sounds like he hasn't let it go." The pieces started falling into place. Jake didn't just reconnect with Emily by chance. He sought her out. But what was his endgame? Was it just about hurting me? Or was there something more? That evening, Emily finally came home. She looked disheveled and tired, but her attitude was as sharp as ever. "Had a good night?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't start, Mike," she said, tossing her bag on the counter. "I'm not in the mood." "Too bad," I said, standing in her path. "You need to tell me the truth. Did Jake come back into your life because of me?" Her eyes flickered with something. "Guilt? Fear? What are you talking about?" she said defensively. "I know about Clearwater," I said. "I know he blames me for what happened back in college. So tell me, Emily, did he come back into your life to get back at me?" She crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" I said, stepping closer. "Because it's starting to look like you've been helping him." Her face turned red, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. But instead, she let out a bitter laugh. "Helping him?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think this is about you? God, Mike, not everything revolves around you." "Then tell me what it's about," I shouted. Her smile disappeared, and for the first time, she looked genuinely cornered. "I was trying to fix things," she said quietly. "Jake needed closure, and I thought if I could help him, maybe I could fix everything you ruined." "Everything I ruined?" I repeated, stunned. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "You've never understood, Mike. Jake lost everything because of you, and I felt responsible for it. I thought if I helped him, maybe I could make it right." "And what does helping him mean, Emily?" I demanded. "Does it mean lying to me? Sneaking around with him? Destroying our marriage?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked upstairs, leaving me standing there with more questions than ever. Emily's refusal to answer my questions left me spiraling. Her tears, her excuses. It all felt like a distraction, a way to avoid admitting the truth. But what was she really hiding? I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them from her. So, I decided to confront Jake again. The next morning, I drove to the cafe near his office, hoping I'd catch him there like before. Sure enough, he was sitting at the same table, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. "Jake," I said, walking up to him. He looked up, his expression flickering between surprise and smugness. "Mike," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Twice in 1 week. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Cut the crap," I said, sitting down across from him. "Why are you really here?" He raised an eyebrow. "I think Emily's already told you." "I'm not talking about Emily," I snapped. "I'm talking about Clearwater. I know what happened back in college, Jake. I know you blame me for losing the internship. So tell me, are you here to get back at me?" His smirk widened. "Took you long enough to figure it out." My chest tightened. "So, this was all a setup?" "Not all of it," he said, shrugging. "Reconnecting with Emily was real enough. She's still the same amazing person she was in college, better even. But yeah, I wanted to see you squirm. And man, you've made it easy." I clenched my fists under the table, my blood boiling. "You've been using her," I said, my voice low. "Using her," Jake repeated, laughing. "You think I forced her into this? She came to me, Mike. She wanted to make things right. She wanted to help me." "Help you do what?" I demanded. He leaned in, his eyes cold. "Take back what you stole from me." I left the cafe, my mind racing. Jake wasn't just angry, he was calculated, methodical. And somehow, he'd convinced Emily to go along with his plan. When I got home, Emily was in the kitchen, sipping tea like nothing was wrong. "Had a nice morning?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Cut the act," I said, throwing my keys on the counter. "I talked to Jake. He admitted everything." Her face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "He told me this was about revenge," I said. "About Clearwater. He blames me for what happened, and he's been using you to get back at me." She shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "That's not true." "Don't lie to me, Emily," I said, my voice rising. "You've been helping him. You've been lying to me for months. So tell me the truth. What have you done?" She stared at me, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said quietly. "What does that mean?" I demanded. Tears welled up in her eyes. but I wasn't buying it. Jake needed help, she said. He lost so much because of you, Mike. I just wanted to make things right. By betraying me? I snapped. By sneaking around with him? She broke down, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what else to do. Her sobs filled the room, but I felt nothing but anger. You've destroyed everything, I said coldly. For what? To make yourself feel better. She didn't respond. That night, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay in that house, not with all the lies and betrayal hanging over me. As I drove to a hotel, I realized that this wasn't just about Emily or Jake. It was about everything I thought I knew falling apart. The hotel room felt like a prison cell. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every word, every lie, every smug smile from Jake. Emily's tears and excuses echoed in my mind, but they didn't move me anymore. She wasn't the victim she wanted me to believe she was. The next morning, I decided I wasn't done. If Jake and Emily thought they could manipulate me, I was going to show them they were wrong. I met with my lawyer, Karen, that afternoon. She was sharp, no nonsense, and exactly the kind of person I needed in my corner. I want to know my options, I said, handing her copies of the emails and messages I'd found. Karen skimmed through them, her lips pressing into a thin line. This is good, she said finally. You've got evidence of an emotional affair at the very least. Depending on how far this went, you could use it as leverage in a divorce. What about Jake? I asked. Can I go after him legally? She shook her head. Unfortunately, there's no law against being a manipulative jerk. But if he encouraged Emily to do something illegal, like hiding assets or sabotaging your business, that's a different story. Her words planted a seed in my mind. Was this just about revenge for Jake? Or was there more to it? That night, I called Nick, my old college friend. Nick, you said Clearwater passed on Jake because of his connection to that scandal, I said. Do you remember the name of the other company involved? He thought for a moment. Yeah, it was something like Prime Solutions. Why? I jotted it down. I have a feeling there's more to this than Jake's letting on. Over the next few days, I dug into Prime Solutions. What I found floored me. The company had gone bankrupt years ago, but not before several executives were accused of embezzlement. And one of those executives, Jake's father. Suddenly, everything clicked. Jake's anger at me wasn't just about losing the internship. It was about his family's downfall. He thought I was part of the chain reaction that destroyed his father's career. When I confronted Emily again, I was armed with this new information. I know why Jake's really doing this, I said, stepping into the house. She looked up from the couch, her face wary. Mike, I don't want to do this again. He blames me for what happened to his father, I interrupted. This isn't about you trying to help him. It's about him trying to punish me for something I had nothing to do with. Her eyes flickered with guilt, and I knew I was right. Did you know? I demanded. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. He told me a few weeks ago, she admitted. But Mike, I swear, I didn't think it was about that at first. I just thought he needed closure. Closure, I said, my voice rising. He's been using you to get to me, Emily, and you've let him. Do you even realize what you've done? Tears filled her eyes again, but this time, I didn't care. Do you even want to fix this? I asked coldly. I don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her words hit me harder than any of Jake's smug smiles ever could. That night, I stayed at the hotel again. For the first time, I started to accept that our marriage might not survive this. After Emily's whispered, I don't know, I knew something had fundamentally broken between us. The marriage I thought I could fight to save was slipping through my fingers, and it wasn't just because of Jake. It was because of her. But I wasn't ready to let them both walk away unscathed. The next morning, I met with my lawyer again, this time armed with the information about Jake's father and Prime Solutions. Karen leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. This changes things, she said. If Jake's been using Emily to target you financially or personally, we might be able to argue that this isn't just an emotional affair. It's intentional harm. What can I do with that? I asked. She smiled faintly. We use it to build leverage. If Emily's been complicit in this scheme, we can make sure you leave the marriage with your finances intact, and maybe even a bit more. Her words gave me hope. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them destroy me. That evening, I returned home, ready to test Emily. She was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone, looking far too calm for someone who'd been caught in her lies. "We need to talk," I said, standing in the doorway. She sighed, putting her phone down. "What now, Mike? I want to know exactly what Jake asked you to do," I said, crossing my arms. Her face tightened. "I already told you." "Don't lie to me, Emily," I interrupted. "I know about Prime Solutions. I know about his father. And I know he's been using you to get back at me. So, what did he ask you to do?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the side. "He didn't ask me to do anything illegal," she said finally, her voice defensive. "That's not an answer," I said. "Did he ask you to sabotage me? To give him information about my business?" Her silence was deafening. "Emily," I said, my voice firm, "if you don't tell me the truth right now, I'll make sure this goes to court. And I'll make sure you and Jake both pay for it." Her eyes flashed with anger, but she finally spoke. "He wanted information about your clients," she admitted, her voice low. "He said it was just to get a sense of how things worked, to see if there was anything he could use to leverage the situation." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "You gave him my client information?" "Just a few names," she said quickly. "It wasn't a big deal, Mike. I swear." "Not a big deal?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "You gave him access to my livelihood, Emily. Do you even understand what you've done?" She stood up, her face defiant. "I was trying to help him." "No," I said, my voice cold. "You were trying to help yourself. You wanted to play the savior, to feel important, and you didn't care who you hurt in the process." Her expression faltered, but she didn't deny it. That night I called Karen again, giving her the full picture. "We've got enough to make a case," she said. "If you're ready, we can file for divorce and include everything, Jake, the client information, all of it. She'll have no choice but to settle." I hesitated for only a moment. "Do it." The decision to file for divorce felt like the final nail in the coffin of everything Emily and I had built. As much as it hurt, there was no coming back from what she'd done. I wasn't just dealing with betrayal. I was dealing with deliberate sabotage of my life and livelihood. When the papers were served, Emily was furious. "You're really going through with this?" she yelled, pacing the living room. "After everything we've been through? After everything you've done," I corrected, standing firm. "You lied to me, gave my client information to Jake, and let him manipulate you into hurting me. What did you expect, Emily? For me to just forget all of it?" She glared at me, her face twisting with anger. "You're not innocent in this, Mike. You've ignored me for years, treated me like I didn't matter. Jake was there when you weren't. That doesn't justify what you did," I said coldly. "And you know it." Her lips tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might say something else. But instead, she grabbed her keys and stormed out. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and emotional fallout. Emily fought hard, but Karen was better. Every piece of evidence I'd gathered, the emails, the financial discrepancies, her admission about the client information, became leverage to protect myself. Jake, meanwhile, tried to keep his distance, but he wasn't off the hook. Through Karen's digging, we discovered that he'd attempted to contact some of my clients directly, spinning lies about my business to try and sabotage my reputation. With this new evidence, Karen filed a separate claim against Jake for defamation and interference with business. It wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about making sure he faced consequences for what he'd done. One evening, Emily showed up unannounced at the house. I hadn't seen her in weeks, and she looked tired, worn down. "What do you want?" I asked, standing in the doorway. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice softer than I'd expected. Against my better judgment, I let her in. She sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked, crossing my arms. For everything, she said, looking up at me with tears in her eyes. I let Jake manipulate me. I let my own resentment cloud my judgment. And I hurt you in ways I can't take back. Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. I don't know what I was thinking, she continued. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I was just making excuses for my own mistakes. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to believe her, to accept her apology and move on. But the damage was done, and I couldn't ignore the betrayal. I appreciate the apology, I said finally, but it doesn't change what happened, and it doesn't fix us. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, she whispered. That was the last time I saw Emily before the divorce was finalized. The divorce was finalized 2 months later. Emily got a modest settlement, but Karen had ensured that my business and most of our savings were protected. Jake's interference with my clients added weight to the case, and the court wasn't sympathetic to Emily's role in the mess. After everything was said and done, I was left with the house, my business, and the pieces of a life I had to rebuild. Jake wasn't so lucky. Karen's defamation and interference claim held up, and he was forced to issue a public retraction for the lies he spread about my business. It didn't undo the damage, but it felt like justice. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Jake left town shortly after the case was settled. Whether he left to avoid further fallout or out of embarrassment, I didn't care. He was out of my life for good. As for Emily, she moved into an apartment across town. We kept communication strictly about the kids, exchanging them for weekends and holidays. She tried a few times to extend olive branches, offering to clear the air or have honest conversations. But I declined. There was no air left to clear. The months that followed were difficult. I spent a lot of time reflecting on what had gone wrong. Not just with Emily and Jake, but in our marriage as a whole. I wasn't perfect. I could admit that. But no amount of self-reflection could excuse the choices Emily made or the lies she told. Therapy helped. It gave me a space to process the anger, the sadness, and the betrayal. Slowly, I started to feel like myself again. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat on the porch with a beer, thinking about how far I'd come. The pain was still there, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It was just a dull ache, a reminder of what I'd lost and what I'd learned. If there's one thing I've taken away from all of this, it's that trust isn't just given, it's earned. And once it's broken, no amount of apologies can put it back together. If you're reading this and dealing with betrayal, know this: it's okay to let go. It's okay to walk away from people who hurt you, even if it's someone you loved. Healing takes time, but it's possible. Thank you for staying with me. This crazy journey is finally over, and I'm ready for what's next. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more interesting stories. And leave a comment with what you would do in this situation. See you in the next videos.